Hi, let's keep discussing the importance of the customer in a digital environment. So this is part 2 of 2. So let's continue. We were starting to discuss how people make choices, right? And to do this, an interesting perspective is this idea of behavioral economics. Now, traditional economic models have basically made a set of assumptions about how people go about making decisions. In particular, traditional economics assumes that the decision maker has perfect information, so knows everything that there is to be known about the environment, about products available, etc. Also, it assumes that they are a utility maximizer, meaning that they can just maybe using differential calculus and by knowing what their utility function is, make a decision that is optimal and perfect for them given the information that they have acquired about the options in the marketplace. And then finally, it also typically assumes that there is no uncertainty associated with any of the information, any of the choices, and maybe more importantly, with their own preference functions, the utility functions. So they know everything that is to be known and there is no uncertainty and they know exactly how to maximize, right? So they know exactly what they're doing. Now, real customers are really not like this. This is a very valuable simplification of reality that has really helped economics as a discipline understand some theoretical concepts. But in practice, people behave differently to at least a reasonable degree, maybe not in all cases. Okay. Now, why do they act differently? Real customers act differently because A, they don't have perfect information. It is true that we have right now more information than we've ever had at our disposal because of smartphones, but still there is a cost associated with acquiring the information and processing that information. So oftentimes a lot of customers do not look at a lot of the information before they actually go ahead and make a decision. Two, this assumption that people are going to maximize utility requires a lot of planning, effort in collecting the information, processing the information, thinking carefully about all the pros and cons and all the options. And in reality, most customers are not involved enough with a decision to spend this kind of time and effort, even if all that information is indeed available in the marketplace, which sometimes is not. Processing and really thinking carefully through it is so much effort that most people are not truly maximizing the utility. They tend to have other strategies that tend to lead to some satisfaction, like they tend to be local satisfier as opposed to maximizers. Okay. And lastly, oftentimes customers have uncertainty associated both with the information and maybe even more importantly, with their own preferences. People usually decide what they like after they have tried multiple products. They don't know upfront what it is, for example, that they are willing to trade off between one product and another. So all these assumptions that traditional economics has made about how people go about making decisions, because they don't all of them show up in the real marketplace, and sometimes none of them do actually. We tend to see a lot of decisions made by people when it comes down to purchasing products, but many other aspects of their lives that differ radically from what the theoretical model says that they should do. Now, what behavioral economics tries to do is tries to marry those traditional economic models about how people go about, for example, making decisions, how customers do, and some of the insights that we have gained from psychology and sociology. And putting that information together and understanding that people are limited in many ways, and the way they go about making decisions is maybe not this theoretical model, they have basically identified a number of biases that people display and maybe some heuristics or shortcuts that people usually make when it comes down to decision making. So let's discuss some of these. And by the way, behavioral economics is a field that it's relatively new, and and it's starting to become more mainstream in the last few years. And several people have gotten Nobel Prizes around this space at this point. For example, Daniel Kahneman. And so it's becoming more mainstream, but there are a lot of schools that they still don't have classes on behavioral economics. So it's relatively becoming mainstream now, although it's not 100%. So let's talk about some of those biases. There are different types of biases, and I'm not going to discuss them all. It's way beyond the scope of this class. But I want to touch on a few of them so that you understand what happens when real people make real decisions. For example, cognitive biases that people display. Typical cognitive bias is this idea of confirmation bias, which is that people tend to select information, what it is that they actually process and retain, based on their prior beliefs. So for example, let's say, for argument's sake, that I'm a big fan of Coke and I don't like Pepsi, right? If I hear, for whatever reason, in the news that Coke is involved in some sort of scandal, I am a lot more likely to dismiss that information because it's inconsistent with my prior beliefs. On the other hand, if I hear that Pepsi is the one involved in this shady business, whatever the shady business is, I am a lot more likely to believe it because basically it confirms my prior beliefs about the brand. So this is the idea of confirmation bias, where you basically are selecting information based on what your prior beliefs are. And as you can understand, most people engage on these type of biases to a larger or smaller degree. Okay. What else? Another bias is inertia bias, which, if you think about it, is similar to what we call in marketing loyalty, at least one type of loyalty. So inertial bias is when you tend to do the same thing or the same actions that you were doing before just because it's comfortable, just because you're used to it, right? So this is buying the same product over and over again, maybe because it's what you've been doing. In fact, this could even be intergenerational. What do you mean by that? You might end up buying the same beauty products that your mom was using because that's what you've seen in the household all the time. And because of that, it is not unreasonable that you will actually buy similar or maybe the same brand that your mom was buying, especially early on the process on you creating preferences about products like, I don't know, daily moisturizers, for example. Good. What else? Myopia bias. This is when you don't realize that there are more things than the ones that you usually see. And what you end up doing is you make decisions based on the information that you tend to observe. What do I mean by that? Well, if I typically go to a small grocery store and there are only 4 different brands of ketchup in the aisle, and then I'm going to make decisions based on that grocery store, and I'm not going to be considering other brands that maybe are available in the market that are not available in the only store that I shop at, where it could be that I'm highly dissatisfied with my ketchup options, and I will be much better off if I were to expand my search criteria. But in this case, because I assume that whatever's available at this store is going to be available at others, I'm making the decision ignoring the potential expansion, in this case, on happiness if I were to maybe go to a different store where I could actually find brands that are not available at the store that I actually usually shop. Okay. What else? Loss aversion bias. This is actually one of the most important effects in this space. Loss aversion is the idea, as we're going to see in the next slide, that losses loom larger than gains when it comes to making decisions. What do I mean by that? What that means is if there is an opportunity that you're going to earn or win or obtain something versus you're going to maybe lose something under some conditions, you're going to tend to look at those losses as much more important in your decision making than the potential improvement that you could gain from the decision. Okay, we're going to discuss this in more detail maybe in the next slide. I think I have a diagram on that. Okay, another thing that is exhibited by a lot of customers is this idea of overconfidence, where you tend to think that and because of that you're very sure about the decisions that you're making. And then finally, this idea of the planning fallacy, where people tend to assign a lower time for a completion of tasks when they are actually doing some planning. And this usually is because there are unforeseen circumstances that are actually going to show up. And because you didn't plan for them, they're going to make the time that it takes for you to complete the task take longer. Okay. Now, following with the biases, like I was mentioning before, loss aversion, and this idea that losses in general loom larger than gains. So you can see that in this diagram. What you can see is that if you're able to earn some money, let's say with a certain probability of that happening, let's make it 50-50, just so that we keep it simple, right? And so here I could make, let's say, 5 cents, or it could be any other quantity if you think 5 cents are so little that maybe it's not worthwhile. What this is trying to basically capture is how much value you associate with those 5 cents, right? And as you can see, the quantity, the height of this is quite a bit smaller than if you actually lose the same amount of money. So if losses and wins will be about equal, the height in this diagram should be the same as the height here. And as you can see, it's more than twice as much. In fact, research in this space shows that typically losses are weighted between 3 and 5 times more than wins. So if you're offered some sort of product that has a potential upside versus a potential downside, like for example, the upside might be that it may be cheaper, the downside it might be that, I don't know, your girlfriend, for example, doesn't like it as much. And in a situation like that, people tend to focus on the losses more than in the potential gains. And this is a bias, obviously, because if humans were not be biased like this, they will be weighted equally in that ideal scenario that I was mentioning before. Finally, another thing that happens is that as humans, because making decisions is a costly thing, we need to put an effort, especially cognitive effort. We need to think about it. What we tend to do is we generate something called heuristics. Now, heuristics are essentially shortcuts. These are basically ways of making the decision easier on ourselves instead of having to process all the information carefully and then maybe after you think about it, coming up with maybe the same or maybe a different decision than with the heuristic. So the heuristic is essentially a shortcut so you don't have to think so carefully and you don't need to put so much cognitive effort when it comes down to making a decision. Now there are many different types of heuristics. I'm only going to mention a few that are particularly pertinent to marketing. Okay. The first one is this idea of the availability heuristic. And what this says is that events that have happened recently, they tend to be weighted as more likely to occur just because of the way our memory works. And because of that, what ends up happening is that we overestimate the probability that that same event will happen. Like, for example, if you go to a casino and you see somebody just hit a jackpot in one of the slot machines, you might over-assign a probability for you to just go and play and actually earn the jackpot. Just because you saw it happen, it just tends to make you think that the chances that you're actually going to observe that event happen again, they are higher than they probably should be, right? Good. That's the availability heuristic one. By the way, this applies to brands because when you see a brand, like let's say an iPhone, right? What that's going to do is it's going to make you more likely to think that a lot of people have iPhones. And because of that, you might actually think that the market share, for example, that iPhone has higher than it actually is. And because of that, if you want to be cool or you want to be one of the people that are in the know or like everybody else, depending on the different strategies that you might have as a consumer, right? What you're going to do is it's going to make you more or less likely to actually purchase that particular brand of smartphone, right? That will be one. The other heuristic that I wanted to discuss is this idea of price quality heuristic. I think most people are aware of this. And what that means is we tend to assume that if the price is higher, the quality of the item is higher. Now, it's interesting that most of the research that has looked at this price-quality relationship in detail, by the way, this research was mostly done in the 70s and 80s. I haven't seen a lot of stuff new because most people already know that this effect is pretty robust. What this price-quality relationship finds is that for ranges of prices that are small enough for the products to be basically competing with each other, and so let's say that if you're comparing cars in the $25,000 to $35,000 range, being that the car is $35,000 versus $25,000 is not, in reality, if you objectively look at the relationship, is not an indication of actual quality. On the other hand, what that same literature finds is if you compare a $25,000 car to a $55,000 car, which is not in the same, let's say, price category, there is a price-quality relationship. Okay, so this price-quality heuristic is based on actual information, but as you can see, if the range of prices is small enough, maybe it will yield some biases or some decisions that are maybe not optimal to consumers because they're using a shortcut that in a small enough range of prices, it's actually not going to work very well. Okay. Finally, at least finally in the ones that I want to discuss here, this idea of anchoring and adjustment is, I think, also important in marketing. What is this idea? The idea that oftentimes we use other information and that is maybe not pertinent directly right now to make a decision about what is large and small, for example, when it comes down to prices. Let me give you an example. Oftentimes when you go to a store and you see a discount price, instead of just showing you the discounted price, what a lot of retailers will do is they will show you was this much, and then the price will be scrunched, and then you'll have the new price. Now, what they are trying to do is they are trying to give you the impression that the value is there by bringing to your attention the fact that the price used to be higher than it is right now. Okay? And this idea of anchoring and adjustment in this case, what it's doing is it's anchoring your value perception by showing you the old price, which is higher, and now they give you a lower price in hopes that now you're going to see that delta or difference, and because of that you're going to think that it's actually a better value than maybe you will otherwise. By the way, anchoring and adjustment is a very reasonable strategy if you acknowledge the fact that probably you don't remember every single price of every single product that you buy on a regular basis, right? So the fact that we actually use this external information oftentimes makes a lot of sense, but of course it can lead to biases because maybe that was information is irrelevant given the other products that are actually available at that store or maybe at some other store, right? Okay. Now, we've discussed some of the implications of behavioral economics on what? Mostly on choice, which is what we're going to be focusing in this class, right? Now, the way we actually go about making these choices, other than, using those cognitive resources that, we are limited on, and because of that, we might actually take some shortcuts or have some biases instead of being perfect utility maximizers like traditional econ would suggest. Choice is essentially picking at least among two alternatives, right? It could be more than two. It typically is more than two in consumer purchase scenarios, right? But of course, by the way, when I say choice, it doesn't have to just purchase. It could be the choice of maybe doing something or not doing something. It doesn't have to be buying a product. So it could be, should I actually go to a website or not? So should I click on a link or not? That is still a choice, right? And you might have 4 links, and then that will be a choice among multiple options. So, but at least you need 2 options to be able to make a choice. This is obvious, right? Now, what influences those choices? Well, obviously there are many factors. We're going to highlight a few of them that are particularly relevant in a digital space. The first one is this idea of word of mouth. Word of mouth is when one of your peers or somebody that you know or somebody that you are related to, maybe an acquaintance, gives you information about the product, for example, or the brand, if we are discussing a marketing situation, right? This is something that was highlighted by Procter & Gamble about 10 years ago with this idea of the 0 moment of truth, right? Which is before you actually go to the store and buy something, is there some information that you can gather that will entice you to actually buy the product before you get to the store? And when I say store, it doesn't have to be a physical store. It could be an online store, right? So before you go to Amazon and actually purchase a product, right? Is there another important stage in your decision-making journey? And what Procter & Gamble suggested is this idea of the 0 moment of truth, which is basically you go online, maybe you go to Google like you have there in the screen, right? And you type in a search. Let's say that you're interested in buying, I don't know, what should we buy? Maybe a mouse for your laptop. Maybe your mouse died. Maybe you want a nicer mouse because for whatever reason you keep losing at your video games and you're thinking that maybe a better mouse will help you succeed. I don't know if that's true or not, but maybe you're thinking that, right? So if you type in computer mouse or laptop mouse, right, in Google, you're gonna get a list of results, right? And that 0 moment of truth is gonna potentially influence what products you buy or not buy, and maybe in this case also where you buy it, right? If the first hit is a particular mouse that is sold by a particular retailer like Amazon, there's a good chance that you will actually click on that link and just directly not only select the product, but also choose the store that you're going to use to acquire such product. Now, when you go to your Amazon page in there, one thing that you are likely to encounter, especially if you spend a little bit of time, is reviews about the product. This is something that has really shifted in the landscape. 20 years ago, reviews were a niche aspect of choosing products. Most of the people will make decisions based on their local environment. That's just friends in a very traditional, maybe family sense. But now you have access to hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews from websites like, for example, Yelp, right? And a lot of customers use those reviews to actually decide what products to choose and which products not to choose. Although in the last few years, you need to be a little bit more savvy on which ones you trust and which ones you don't, because every brand and every manufacturer now knows the influence of reviews, and they are actually actively trying to influence this. So you need to be a little bit more cognizant as a customer when it comes down to making those decisions. Okay, good. Now, what else influences your choices? Well, the obvious answer is your personal preferences, right? And there are certain people that like certain things, and this should be no surprise. If you have a way of knowing what the customer has done in the past, and you probably should be doing this already, you will have a database of the product that the customer has bought. This history of actions, maybe clicking in different links within your website, and product purchases will be a good reference to know what kind of preference the customers actually exhibit. So there is information that you can gather, obviously, especially in a digital space, about personal preferences for customers that it's relatively easy to gather without having to go out of your way of asking, just by looking at their actual behavior. You can track customers using things like cookies. We'll talk about this more in the future. Okay, so personal preferences. What else? Another thing that maybe is indicative of the behavior that I was discussing that maybe you can have in a database is this idea of a habit. Now, a habit is not necessarily the same thing as a preference, although oftentimes they are going to intertwine. So a habit is when you create some sort of automatic response to a cue in the environment. What is a cue? A cue is something external to you that elicits, that triggers the action. In this case, the action is what we're going to be discussing as a habit, because the cue and the habit happen together. Give me an example, Professor, because I'm lost. Good. So let me tell you, for example, a habit that I have. A habit that I have is I go and work out 3 times a week over the week, the weekend, during the week. And the way I do it, because I have 3 kids, and I'm trying to spend as much time as I can with them, because they matter more than more workouts, right? What I do is I wait until they go to bed before I actually go and work out. So that means that around 10:15, when everybody's already in bed, my wife included, I just go to my local gym and I work out for 45 minutes or an hour, right? So I have created a habit, right? In my case, it's Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, right? Well, Saturday's a little bit different because the gym closes a lot earlier. Anyway, long story short, I've basically, when that cue comes, in my case, when I see in my watch that it's 10 o'clock, I know that it's time for me to go to the gym. And that's ingrained at this point. I've been doing this for roughly about 5 years, right? So after you repeat this cue and action and set of events enough times, you will build a habit. And once that you have a habit, it's a lot easier for you to conduct the action, and the reason why is because it requires really low cognitive effort. I don't even need to think about it, okay? I just do it, and the reason why I do it is because I've been doing it for literally, in my case, thousands of times, right? Thousands of times, is that right? No, I'm being a little bit, I've been a little bit flippant. It's more about 750 times, but it's a large number of times, right? So you ingrain a habit. Now, the nice thing about habits is once that you ingrain that habit, people tend to repeat it, right, with really low cost. So how can you leverage this? Well, an obvious answer to this is try to create some sort of cue and action scenario where you just basically facilitate that habit creation. How could you do that? Well, you could create it with a loyalty program. We're going to discuss this in more detail later, right? But there are ways where you can have that cue and lead to that action in a consistent basis, and by doing that over and over again, it will ingrain the habit, lower the effort associated with making the decision, and by achieving that, you will get that action easier, right? Adding to this idea of the decision load, making decisions is costly. By costly, I mean mentally costly. There is effort associated with it. So because of that, we tend to minimize it, right? We don't like effort as humans, by the way. So because of that, we tend to minimize basically the load associated with the decisions that we make. One way of doing this, I've already discussed, is this idea of a habit, right? We build habits so that we don't have to think about it, right? And by the way, so that you can see how strong our dislike is for mental effort when it comes to decision making, there is this interesting effect, at least I find interesting, of the morning morality effect, which is people tend to make better choices for them in the morning than in the evening. And the main reason why is because in the evening we are tired from the whole day of making decisions, right? And because of that, we tend to engage in actions that are, let's just say, not so good for our well-being, right? And you can define this however you want, and there are different ways of operationalizing it, right? But you can see this all the time. Now, if you're a company that is trying to basically leverage this, and you're trying to basically make people's lives easier, what you're going to do is you're going to try to think about basically how can you set up that choice so that you are minimizing the effort associated with making the choice, right? So this is why you're going to see most companies trying to have you install their app in your phone. And there is a myriad of reasons, and I know it's the only reason is not to lower the choice and effort. But one of the reasons why everybody wants their app in your phone is because once that you have the app, let's say, for example, Amazon, right? You can just click on the app and directly access the brand, the services, the choices, the purchases, right? So it's lowering the cost for you to interact or engage with the brand. And because of that, you are a lot more likely to do it, right? What else? Another thing that is associated with lowering this cognitive effort is the idea of a default. Okay, it's basically highlighting some sort of no choice option for the customer that will actually be beneficial for them. The way you pick this, theoretically, is by, as an expert, thinking what will be the average customer choosing in this scenario, right? So let's say, for example, that you have different service levels, right? There's the free version that has, very low functionality, but, has a low price associated with it. And then you have maybe other tier of services, one that has some basic services associated with it at a reasonably low, but definitely non-zero price. And then you might have a more premium version that has all services associated with it, but a much higher price. Now, what you need to do, and you need to be honest about this with yourself, because otherwise people are going to be thinking that you're trying to basically make them choose something that is not in their best interest, is think about who your target market is, and based on that, which of these options should be as your default. And then you should create an environment that will highlight that default for them so that people don't have to make the difficult choice, right? You're telling them, hey, if you're a customer like this, you should choose this option, right? Okay. So defaults, very powerful way of helping customers make decisions easier, okay? Finally, this idea of choice architecture, which kind of assembles all the information that I've discussed so far, is basically how you engineer the choices for your customers. So instead of putting all the information and all the choices ahead of them, for example, in your website or in your app, what you do is you use a smaller set of those choices that you think are gonna improve the chances that the customer will make a good decision. And by the way, good decision means one that they are going to be happy with, and because of that, they're going to keep coming back to you. So you're not trying to rip off customers, which you can do with this, by the way, but that only takes you so far. Okay, so it's in your best interest to try to help customers make good decisions. And the way you do that is you structure these choices in a way that makes the customer more likely to make a good choice for them. They are the ones that decide if it's good or not you. Okay, and the way you do that, a couple of principles that tend to help. One is provide a few but a small number of choices. Don't have 157 options because nobody can process all that information. This is when, for example, when you go to Netflix, you're not going to see every movie in the Netflix catalog in front of you. You could not process that information. What you do is you have a small set of movies, maybe 6 or 8 at a time, that are shown to you based on some filters that you can actually easily change. And those filters that may actually be suggested as the best filters for you based on your prior history, right? So what Netflix is trying to do is trying to minimize your effort and show you some options that they think are potentially useful for you, but not give you all the information at once, because customers cannot process large number of choice sets. Okay, number one. Number two, it is usually a good idea to have some sort of recommended options. Okay, for example, Netflix will have an option that will say recommended for you, or we think you will like this, right? So these are according to maybe some algorithms that they use and data from your past interactions with the service. They make some suggestions that they think are going to be potentially good for you, that they think you're going to like. Okay, so that's how you will pick your defaults in that scenario. Okay, and then finally, if it's a very clear-cut scenario like you have here in the slide, where there are just 3 or 4 options for a service that obviously the customer is interested in acquiring because they are already at that page where you're making a choice about which one of the levels of service you're getting, then maybe highlight the one that you're defaulting using some sort of Q. Q could be different color, like in this case, it's green versus blue in all the other options, or it could be a different size, right, of font and size of the option, or it could be any other physical characteristic that it's easy to identify by the customer, so they can quickly, without having to think carefully, which means a lot of effort. It's not because you don't want them to realize that they're making a mistake. It's not about mistakes, it's about helping. Okay, try to minimize the effort associated with the choice. Okay. Finally, for this presentation, another aspect that you should seriously consider by this point is creating a customer experience map. What is this idea? Well, the idea is you need to basically map your customers to the actions that the customers are undertaking within your site, within your app, anytime that they engage or interact with you, okay? And what you're going to realize, by the way, is there is not only one experience map, there are going to be multiple experience maps, depending on what customers are we referring to. So if you have, let's say, 3 or 4 personas, you will have for each of the personas a different map. And it is possible that if you have different ways of engaging with customers, that you will have a different experience map for each of those ways of engaging with them. So it could be that you'll have an experience map for your app, an experience map for your website. And if you have 3 segments, that is a total of 6 different maps, 3 times 2, right? Good. And the way you're going to do this is you're going to go through the different stages of the customer journey that we have already discussed in the Principles of Marketing class. So you're going to start with awareness, then you're going to move to consideration, right? This will be the brands that are good enough for the customer to seriously consider and maybe think about a little bit more, maybe do a little bit of research on. By research, I mean look at their characteristics that are already posted on the website. This is not necessarily involved, right? And that will be the consideration set. Then after that, you will move to the decision, right? And you're going to be in a situation where sometimes the customer is going to choose one option, sometimes going to choose another one, and the criteria they're going to use might be quite different, right? This will be really quick and gut-based information where you're not doing a lot of information search if it's something that is not that important to you, or it could be something that might take days, weeks, or even months if you're making a very important decision, like maybe buying a new home or a new car, for example, right? And then finally, you're going to be, evaluating maybe your long-term options and see if they are actually staying loyal to you. By the way, this might take a long time to gather sensible information if you're talking about some product categories, whereas in case of others, this might be trivial, right? If it's a product category that you buy daily or weekly, right, it's going to be easy for you to gather data. If it's a more long-term prospect, like in the case of a car, it might take quite a bit of time for you to be able to gather enough data so that you can make decisions about this part. And then finally, advocacy, right? This is something, by the way, that is a lot easier to track online than it is offline, right? You can actually observe, for example, in a social media or social platform context, how the customer is engaging with other potential customers about your brand. You're going to see positive, you're going to see negative comments, right? You're going to see that advocacy happening without having to explicitly ask customers. This is one of the blessings, I guess, and a curse of being in a digital environment where you can actually gather quite a bit of data really easily if you're doing things right. And the downside of this is now you have a lot of data to shift through, and so that you can actually gather insights. And after you do all this associated with each of these stages, you're going to have to create goals and metrics, right? And how are you going to measure those goals that you're trying to achieve, right? And those goals are going to vary, right? Awareness versus conversion versus advocacy. Those are going to be totally different in terms of how you're going to measure them. And we're going to discuss metrics in more detail in multiple chapters as we go. And that's all I have for you guys today.